If you're anything like me, one of the many concerns that you probably had about a second Trump administration was what that would do to the relationship between the United States and NATO, and probably even more importantly, between the United States and Ukraine. But one of the few surprisingly pleasant things to come out of Trump's first week in office is the fact that based on how he's positioning himself and the threats that he is making, Trump might not be as opposed to Ukraine as many of us would have anticipated based on what he was saying on the campaign trail. But before we get into that, a little bit of backstory. If you don't remember, Trump has had a very troubled relationship with Ukraine throughout his political career. His first impeachment was over the fact that he was basically abusing his political power to try and get the Ukrainians to give him dirt on Joe Biden's family after Hunter Biden had worked in the country. So it's a bit contentious there. And throughout the war that kicked off in 2022, Trump has been surprisingly positive in how he has spoke about Putin, referring to the man as a genius. And he has been very, very critical of the Ukrainian state, of Zelensky, and even the notion of the United States providing the scale of aid that it is to Ukraine. And throughout the 2024 campaign, Trump was adamant that he was going to end the war in Ukraine, even at one point saying that he would wrap it up within 24 hours of entering office. And a lot of people were concerned that when they hear Trump saying that he's going to wrap the war up, what he really means is that he's going to cut as much aid as he can and force the Ukrainians into an agreement that is incredibly beneficial to the Russians. But I think that Trump has come across a couple of realities since taking back the reins of power when it comes to how to achieve something in Ukraine that resembles peace and who his actual rivals are and who's opposing him in that objective. The first realization there is a matter of ego, and that is the fact that Trump cannot walk away from Ukraine without it coming across as a loss for him personally. If he wants to get peace there and leave the situation to its own devices, that's fine. But he has to accept that the worse he leaves the situation for NATO and for Ukraine, the more he is internationally going to be perceived as having failed in that effort. And that, quite honestly, is not something that Trump is willing to risk. And the second thing is that Trump is going to realize how much of a nightmare negotiating with Putin and the Russians is going to be. Because they are stubborn and they want to win almost as much as he does. So it's not this situation of him coming in and assuming, oh, I've been kind to Vladimir Putin throughout my years, I've said nice things about him, I've flattered him. But then when he gets to the negotiating table, he is not going to find someone who is there to make friends. He is going to find Vladimir Putin, a man who is militarily committed and stubborn and arrogant, almost as much as Trump himself, who is not willing to budge, an awful negotiating partner. So what has Trump actually done so far in terms of his actions and his declarations and statements to show that he is more pro-Ukraine as opposed to his rhetoric on the campaign trail? Well, the first good sign if you're pro-Ukrainian is the fact that Zelensky has openly talked about the fact that he has had very constructive and positive conversations with the Trump administration. And I think you should take Zelensky at his word there, because if discussions with the Trump administration were going terribly, he would certainly voice that with the hopes of the European members of NATO seeing the sense of urgency and giving more support themselves to Ukraine. But that isn't the case. Zelensky said that he is in a good position with the Trump administration, and things seem to be productive. Now, the second thing to consider are the direct threats that Trump has been making economically against the Russian state since he came back into power. The first of those threats being issued, of course, via Truth Social, which is apparently where you will get all updates on America's foreign policy from now on. This long, rambling post where Trump talks about his love and respect for the Russian people and how he wants what's best for them is capped off by him basically saying that if he can't bring Putin to the negotiating table, if Putin remains obstinate and trying to block talks of peace, then Trump is going to issue an entirely new era of sanctions on the Russian state in the hope specifically of crushing Russia's economy. Now, we don't have any specifics here, and of course there have already been plenty of sanctions placed on the Russians by the West since the war kicked off, but I think this is honestly something that should be taken seriously, because look at how Trump did the exact same thing to the Iranian economy during his first term. And look at the fact that just, I believe today, when Colombia was refusing to accept flights of deported migrants from the United States, that Trump has started issuing emergency tariffs against Colombia. So we have already seen proof, both in his first term and now in his second term, that he is willing to use economic warfare like this at the drop of a hat. So I would take this seriously. Now, the second threat, or I suppose you call it a demand, was when Trump was speaking directly to OPEC. Now, OPEC is a collection of nations that control a vast portion of the world's oil production. And OPEC basically functions as a cartel, artificially controlling the cost of oil on the global market for their own benefit. Countries like Saudi Arabia, many Middle Eastern states that control, Venezuela is a part of it. Basically, a giant international cartel that controls the cost of oil globally. And speaking to them, Trump was very direct in the fact that he wants oil prices to go down. And that is very important because part of what is keeping the Russian economy alive is the fact that it can drill for oil, export it, and then make money off those sales. And at the moment, the price of oil, some would say, is arbitrarily high because of OPEC's meddling in its price. So if OPEC did make the decision to work together and lower the cost of oil on a global scale, that would be a catastrophe for what is left of the Russian economy. And Trump has proven that he is more than willing to make some pretty direct threats to OPEC to get them to do what he wants. I think the most egregious example being when in 2020, Saudi Arabia, the most influential member of OPEC, Trump threatened to withdraw all military support for if they didn't change the price of oil to a way that he thought was acceptable. So Trump has been here before and he has made threats like this for years now. So these are just a few signs of Trump putting together like the basic groundwork for a system that would explicitly punish Putin and the Russian state for not coming to the table. And we haven't seen if those will work yet, but I do think it is an interesting first step, as it were, towards Trump realizing what the state of play is on the ground between Russia and Ukraine. What I think we're going to see in the coming weeks, months, and maybe even years is Trump come to terms with the fact that reality is different from what he thought it was. I think that he genuinely believed that the state of the war in Ukraine was something that had rambled out of control because he wasn't there. That somehow he was an X factor that would change everything. But as he settles into power, he's going to realize that Vladimir Putin is not someone who's won over by niceties. The man that he respected, that he was on good terms with throughout his first entire term, he is going to slowly have to accept is not someone that can practically be negotiated with. Now, look, I am genuinely optimistic about this as someone who is incredibly pro-Ukraine, and I want to share that optimism here. And I'm being sincere. I mean, this is a chunk of a Russian tank that was destroyed by the Ukrainian military, which is now part of my keychain. I've done brand deals and sponsorships and worked with Ukrainian companies trying to get off the ground and recover from the war. And the reason that I'm optimistic is because I genuinely believe that Trump's unfettered ego, that desire to prove himself and to not be a loser, that is going to drive him to realize what everyone has already known for the better part of a decade. And that is the fact that when the Russian imperial fascist war machine is rolling into Europe, at a certain point, if you want to win, you have to step up, you have to man up, and you have to break its fucking teeth.